Buen día, buenos días a todos y a todas los que nos acompañáis aquí presencialmente y a todos los que estáis al otro lado de la pantalla. Para los que no estabais en la sesión anterior, soy Olivia Blanchard, investigadora y consultora independiente especializada en el impacto de la tecnología en la sociedad. Y hoy tengo el gran placer de estar aquí acompañada de Uma Rani, economista senior de la Organización Internacional del Trabajo, que es el organismo especializado de las Naciones Unidas dedicado a temas laborales y las relaciones laborales en todo el mundo. Es un gran placer estar acompañada de Uma hoy, porque precisamente llevamos como 3 o 4 años comunicándonos por email y por Zoom, y poder estar con ella presencialmente para mí es un lujo, y estoy muy agradecida que haya aceptado nuestra invitación para venir a Barcelona. Así que, welcome, Uma.
Thank you.
Uma es referente en el estudio y en el análisis del trabajo en plataformas, que es el tema que vamos a abordar en el día de hoy. Lideró un estudio de gran envergadura en el 2021 que se titula El papel de las plataformas digitales en la transformación del mundo del trabajo. En este estudio se contó con encuestas con más de 7.000 trabajadores en todo el mundo, y la verdad es que ha sido una gran referencia en la literatura sobre este tema en los últimos años. Antes de pasarle la palabra, me gustaría contextualizar el tema que estamos tratando dentro del contexto del ciclo que estamos organizando con el Observatorio Social de la Caixa y el programa Incorpora, que es sobre la transformación digital del trabajo y cómo impacta en los colectivos más vulnerables y en ciertos sectores. La decisión de dedicar una de las sesiones a este tema del trabajo en plataformas viene porque, según la propia OIT, la Organización Internacional del Trabajo, este fenómeno es uno de los más importantes de las últimas décadas en cuanto al impacto en el entorno laboral. Han pasado ya 15 años desde que una noche, en un frío invierno en París, 2 emprendedores asistieron a una conferencia sobre tecnología y al salir no encontraban taxi y se decían entre ellos: ostras, ¿no? Sacaron el móvil, ya había salido el smartphone, ¿no? un año antes, y dijeron: ¿no estaría bien si pudiéramos reservar, dijeron, una limusina, ¿no? a través de alguna aplicación en el móvil? Bueno, pues esa noche, ahí esa conversación fue la semilla de Uber. Luego esos 2 emprendedores volvieron a sus casas, le dieron vuelta a la idea y no fueron limusinas, fueron taxis, pero así es como se empezó la plataforma Uber, que no fue la primera, pero sí que ha sido muy importante en cuanto al impacto que ha tenido en el sector y también por las tendencias que ha marcado, ¿no? en el entorno laboral en general. Hoy hablaremos de todo esto. Con Uma le he pedido que nos ayude a situar, ¿no? el tema, que nos explique qué modelos de plataformas hay, porque veremos no todos son como Uber. No todos son como Uber. Y sí, ahora ya estamos otra vez de vuelta. Veremos que no todas las plataformas son como Uber, entonces nos hará una exposición de cuáles son los diferentes modelos, qué impacto han tenido, qué evidencia tenemos, qué datos tenemos, y luego pasaremos a un diálogo entre Uma y yo y un turno de preguntas y respuestas. Va a hacer la presentación en inglés, el diálogo también lo haremos en inglés, tenéis todos el dispositivo si queréis escucharlo, la traducción simultánea. Y bueno, bienvenidos y bienvenidas de nuevo. Así que, Uma, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Olivia. And it's a real pleasure to be here also with you in person and to have this discussion as well as a dialogue. And thank you very much for all of you for coming here. So, is it possible to stand and talk? Yeah? Okay. And I just do this, right? Okay. Because I'm more comfortable standing rather than sitting and talking about it. So, what I'm going to talk to you about is research that we have been doing at the ILO for almost 8 years now, since 2016, on understanding what these platforms are and how are they transforming the world of work. And over the last 8 years, I think we have done about easily 18,000 interviews with workers around the world in different sectors, on different platforms, to understand what the potential risks are and what the opportunities that are there, both for the workers as well as for small and large establishments in the world. So Olivia started by talking about Uber, which is about 15 years old. But actually, the story of platforms dates back even before it. Uber was a pioneer, and it made a huge break into the market. But way before that, in 1999, one of the first platforms that came up was Topcoder and Innocentive in the talent field, or what is called as competitive programming or software platforms. And the reason why they came up with that was technology was changing at a very, very rapid pace. And they felt that software programming needs to move to a different level. So they came up with a community of coders and programmers, actually, bringing them onto a platform to do this work. At the same time, you also saw Elance coming up, which was a freelance platform, also developed around the same idea. And then in 2005, because of Amazon, which wanted to have its own e-commerce platforms and wanted to categorize work, we saw the rise of what is called today as microtasking platform. So, there's a history to each of these platforms coming over the last 25 years. So, if you really think about it, it's a quarter of a decade since we have platforms. And if you look at regulations, we are we are far away from it even today. And even if you just look at the past decade, since 2010, you see the rise of platforms by almost fivefold, and there are a number of reasons why they have grown. One is because of cloud computing and cloud infrastructure, which has made it very easy to set up these platforms. And as it's in the cloud, it doesn't require a lot of investment, and anybody can actually set it up. It's also because data has become very important, not only as a commodity in itself, but also because it is used for algorithms, because you see increasingly automated decision-making processes happening where this data can be used, and it's also used for monetization purposes. And there's a lot of availability of venture capital funds, which makes it very easy for many entrepreneurs to set up the platforms. Now, all of this also means that there are innovative ways in which work can be done, and much of the, the story behind the narratives of the platforms has been that it provides a flexibility for both workers and businesses, and this is also one of the reasons why it's taken hold. And we saw that with the COVID-19 pandemic, there was increasing dependence on platforms, whether you're talking about e-commerce platforms or whether you're talking about freelance or microtasking or talent or software platforms. So there's been a huge rise, and we also saw a huge rise in delivery platforms and delivery workers despite the pandemic. Now, there are different narratives that they are there for the digitalization and digital labor platforms. Let me put them around 2 or 3 issues. One of the narratives that comes around is about how in developing countries it can address the unemployment issue, poverty issue, or inequality issue because they can create employment opportunities. This narrative does not just restrict to developing countries today, and we also talk about it within the European context, even within the Spanish context in a way, depending upon the unemployment situation. The second narrative is around how you could use technology to formalize workers, because you have now a technology that can register. But I think what is not thought about within the formalization debate is how you can ensure that the worker benefits can also be provided through such a technology. And the third narrative that comes about is that how this technology can actually address much of the digital divide that is there, that is between countries, but also between genders and between different vulnerable groups of population. But while these narratives are being said, there's a lot of contestation that also happens, and there are many who are trying to argue that in reality, it's far from there. And what my presentation is going to do today is basically get you to this debate to understand whether it actually addresses some of the challenges that we have in the labor market, or whether it exasperates it, or what is the story that we hear from the workers per se. Now, when you think about the platforms, I think many of us know of Uber, or we know of Deliveroo, and that's the platform narrative that falls around it. And especially if you're in Spain, the riders law that came in for delivery workers, you think that's the only platform that exists. But in reality, platforms have penetrated different sectors of the economy. Any sector you want to talk today, you have platforms operating. From education, that is tutoring, to software coding, to microtasking. And as we go by, I give you some examples so that you understand what they are. Freelancing, legal and patent services. The pandemic also saw a huge rise in medical consultation platforms because you saw a lot of doctors who could actually, from their home, provide advices to a lot of patients in remote areas, in urban areas where you could not go. You have a rise of healthcare platforms for nurses and technicians and care workers. And then you have within the location-based platform a whole range of them, from taxi, delivery, to care workers, to beauty workers, domestic workers, personal services that you see. So you touch a sector today, you find a platform that is operating. Now, I think what's very important for us to understand is what is very particular about a platform business model. How does it differ from a way a traditional business operates? And I think that's fundamental for us. Because if we don't understand that, it's very difficult for us to say, okay, what is it that needs to change in the platform business model so as to ensure that the benefits can be reaped by everyone, both the businesses as well as the workers. The first thing is it's all ICT enabled. By ICT enabled, what do we mean? What we mean is, and Olivia very nicely said, the smartphone that came up, which tried to link different people. So that ICT technology actually helps to connect workers with different types of clients. It could be customers, it could be businesses, it could be small-scale businesses, it could be restaurants, it could be traders, it could be anybody. And this is a very good function because it can improve efficiency, but the way it is then utilized becomes problematic. And this is one of the fundamental changes that happens. And this technology then does not only help in matching and the client with the worker and allocating the task to the worker, but it also follows the worker, monitors them, supervises them, and if they think that the work is done rightly, then it rewards them. And in this process, what it does is, it is also collecting the data of the worker. It's trying to see where is the worker going, what are the destinations, if it's a taxi or a delivery or a domestic worker, where is the worker going, which are the destinations, how much time do they take to do the work, how do they do the work, and that data is then collected for the automated decision-making process further. That is, you're using it to train the machine learning algorithm that is there. And that's very, very unique. And that's very different from a traditional business model. The second thing that this model does is, and that's very fundamental, is it actually shifts the entire risks and cost from a particular business establishment to the worker. What do I mean by this? Now, let me take a case of a freelance worker. So a freelance worker or even a taxi driver in many of these cases needs to have their own capital assets. So a freelance worker would need to have a computer, a place to work, electricity, internet charges, and all the other maintenance costs. And a taxi driver would need to have a taxi. If they do not have one, then you hire or rent it from somewhere. They have to put all the fuels and the maintenance cost. And if something doesn't go well, the entire responsibility is on the worker. So the platform, it's very easy. If the business model doesn't work, they shut the shop and leave. Whereas a traditional business wouldn't work like that. You invest in a place, you invest in the capital that is required, you invest in all the resources that are required, and then you hire the worker, and you also give a contract to the worker and provide labor and work-related benefits. Here, you don't have to do that because you are identifying them as an independent contractor, which is a third point that I want to raise. So as an independent contractor, all the responsibility is then onto the worker to provide themselves social protection benefits as well as work-related benefits. Now, this becomes problematic, largely because if a worker is working on a particular platform for a particular number of years, builds up a reputation, rating, tries to do the work, and suddenly, for some reason, the platform shuts, the worker is left loose. He has to then look for another platform and then build up his reputation and rating and then go about it. So this is what this platform business model is fundamentally changing, the way we organize work and the way we conduct work. And it's shifting the responsibility onto the workers. And that creates a lot of problems. Now, one thing one could argue is, especially when you're talking about freelance, microtasking, and software programming, it shifts the responsibility onto the workers, but there is a huge benefit that is there for many of the small-scale companies or large companies who can actually outsource this work onto these workers through the platform, and they're able to reduce costs because they can get, like if I take an example of software programming today. So, you have a lot of IT companies that are there. So there are many of them which are part of outsourcing companies. What they do is they outsource the problem that is there onto the platform, and they give it to a crowd with price context. And there's a community of coders, programmers who actually try to solve that problem. So that particular client would get about 50 responses to that problem. And it's possible that about 20 of them are fantastic, and only 3 people win the prize that is on the top 20. But for the client, within that short period of time, they are able to get innumerable solutions to do. So it reduces cost, improves efficiency, and you get a number of innovative ideas. So that's very good for the firms. But at what cost does it come is one of the biggest questions that comes up. And that's one of the reasons why we look into it. Now, I'm going to talk to you about the 4 narratives here as I go by. And one sec. The first narrative I do want to talk about is location-based platforms. This is about the taxi, delivery, domestic services, healthcare services, beauty, personal, you name it, whichever is there within the location-based platforms. Now, one of the questions that comes up often is, why are workers working on these platforms if the working conditions are not good? And I guess part of the reason why that happens is your local labor market situation is not so good. So platforms have come in to that space as it is a vacuum and tried to provide the same services using a technology, and they think this is very good. Not only that, when the platforms are entering these markets, they try to attract them by providing them with a lot of incentives. So they think that they're getting a lot of money. That is for a very short period of time, and that goes away, and then the workers are left to the algorithmic management per se. And many of them do it to supplement other incomes because your local labor market employment is not providing you the kind of incomes that is enough for you to run your household per se. And the narrative that is there often from the platforms about job or work flexibility is also something they very clearly see. That, oh yes, I can work in between handling my household and other care responsibilities, especially when it comes to women. So that's one of the reasons why they do. But what happens as a result of it is less understood, is that you do not get a status, even though it is a platform that matches you, which allocates work, which monitors and supervises work, and eventually rewards you. They do not realize till a point of time that this employment status is not that of an employer-employee relationship, but that of a self-employed or an independent contractor. And many platforms have their own way of classifying that. It could be a partner or whatever they fancy, and this terminology is quite widespread. Now, you can say that many of these workers in the traditional labor market can also be self-employed or independent contractors, but what's very different is that they have control over the work that they have, which they lose onto the platform, because that algorithm goes about controlling whether you're going to get the work or not going to get the work. And you do not have the freedom to say no, because if you do say no or you cancel anything, then that has repercussions on your access to work per se. So as a result of it, what you see is a transformation in labor processes and work relationships through what is called as algorithmic management practices. Because what becomes very important today using platforms is, what is your rating? What is your reputation? How good are your reviews from the customer? Sometimes you can do your work very well, but the customer is in bad mood and is annoyed not with you, but because of other people, and then decides to give you a bad review. Now, this has repercussions on the workers. Or sometimes they want, if you're in a taxi, the client wants you to go at a very high speed, but you're not supposed to go because you have to follow certain regulations. And then if you don't follow, then they get very angry because they know they have to reach the destination. They don't think that it's their responsibility, but that of the driver, and then they give a bad review. Now, all that has implications on their ratings, which has implication on their access to work per se. And it can happen that sometimes workers do not get work for a particular period of time, or their accounts can be deactivated completely. So this kind of a mechanism where it's not the platform that actually monitors, but the whole thing being transferred onto the clients also poses a lot of problems. But at the same time, I have to say that workers are monitored all the time using GPS, and they can also be taken to task depending upon a combination of the reviews and the reputation and all of that that comes in. Now, what we have seen is that in both the taxi, delivery, care workers, as well as domestic workers and beauty workers across the globe, if you cancel a task, so you know the freedom and flexibility that is talked about does not really exist in reality, because if you cancel a task because you have other jobs or you don't want to go to that destination, then you're penalized. Your rating can go down. You might not get work for a particular period of time, or you can be deactivated. And workers often don't have any control over the pricing. They are market determined. They are determined by the demand and supply, and that has a huge impact on the workers, because in the traditional labor market, the same type of work is collectively bargained, or there are regulations that go about saying what a taxi ride would cost, how much a delivery worker would get, or how much a domestic worker would get. And these has implications on them. So what we see very clearly is income instability, lack of access to work, lack of work-related and social protection benefits, and you see increasing precaritization of this work. Though many of them are in the informal economy, the platforms precarize them further. The second narrative that I want to talk about is the new jobs. Now, there is a lot of talk about platforms and how they have been creating a lot of jobs. And my contention is that as far as location-based platforms are there, it doesn't really create too many jobs. Probably the only sector that it creates many jobs is within the delivery sector. In all other sectors, it's a shift from the traditional labor market to the platform. But where new jobs are created is related to the Web 2.0. And these are largely coming in micro-task platforms and in BPO call centers. There are 4 types of jobs that you can see. One is AI machine learning. I'll give you some examples in the next slide on what they are. It relates to online clerical data entry tasks, audio image recording, and annotation of both image and text, which is largely done for autonomous cars, largely comes from huge automobile manufacturing companies because they want to move into an autonomous vehicle in the future. The second, with the Web 2.0, is promotion of products and services. Today, if you want your website to be promoted onto the top, just pay a few dollars to either a microtask platform or to a BPO center, and they will have an army of clickers going and clicking onto the platform and having your profile on the top. So, if somebody wants to come to Barcelona and look for which are the good restaurants that are there or which are the good hotels, they get on to one of those sites and look for it. And you say, oh, wow, it's got 10 reviews on 10 on 10. This must be the best. But what you fail to realize that it's not the tourists who are doing it, but it's an army of workers who are actually going and feeding all of that, giving those reviews and trying to get some of this in app. So there's a lot of fake ethical questions that can be raised. The third is the content moderation, which is very important. Today, when you get onto the web 2.0, you often don't find any objectionable materials. And you often think, oh, wow, that must be the algorithm because, software has gone so high, it's doing so well, we have all of this new technologies and new learning models coming in. So all of that is being done by that. What we fail to realize is that there's an army of invisible workers behind the computer actually doing this kind of work. In 2017, when we were doing this work, the YouTube CEO, I think it was based on something that came out, said that, oh, well, we don't do any content moderation. It's all algorithmically done. And 95% of it is algorithmically done. But what he failed to say was that because 5% of it is not done algorithmically, all of that material is actually sieved by human labor in India, Kenya, Philippines, and other destinations. We have more destinations like Malaysia, Indonesia joining in, where you have workers, very highly educated, who sieve through thousands of objectionable material, which could be hate speeches, pornographic images, war images, and then try to say, okay, all of this does not go into the web. And that's a huge industry that is coming up. And the fourth is the AI-related tools. We've seen that, and this is colleagues in another institution who have been following, and something that we have been doing too, where we found that, there's a lot of AI-related tools that are being sold, whether you're talking about security systems, secretarial services, and all of it. And you think, oh, wow, AI technology exists, companies are buying it, and wow, this is all done. But actually, the security system, there is no AI in it. You have CCTVs, and there are workers in India, Madagascar, Kenya, looking through the CCTVs, and then trying to see whether somebody's stealing something from the supermarkets or whatsoever, sending a WhatsApp message and trying to get them. And this is something, the security systems are in operation apparently in France in all the supermarkets, but there's no AI. So you have a lot of workers actually doing this task. Now, this is a quick example of tasks on microtask platforms. The first one on your left, is somebody who's doing AI training, and the person, what they are supposed to do is take videos of certain hand movements so many number of times and record them, and they very clearly specify what is to be recorded, how it is to be recorded, what the quality of the record has to be, and how many times, and then you have to upload it. And if you really look at it, the number of recordings that have to be done on drawing letters and digits in the air and how much you get paid, there's a complete inconsistency in what you get paid and the amount of time you spend. And this is a kind of work that is done by very highly qualified people to get some income. On the right-hand side is what I talked about, promotion of products and services. There are a couple of things I want you to look at there. One is how it very clearly discriminates certain countries from participating. So you say it's global, but it's not really global. It says that it'll give $0.12 for it, and it also says that it'll take less than 3 minutes to finish it. But if you go through the instructions and you do what they ask you to do, it takes you at least 6 minutes. Not only that, all that a worker, this is called as clicking, all that a worker is supposed to do is go onto the website, stay on that website for a couple of minutes, move to the website on another page and stay there. So what you're doing as a result is just promoting products and services, and which raises some fundamental questions about who these workers are and what they do. And if you look at it, you find that many of them are highly educated, both in the developed and developing world. You also have a Spanish sample in this because this was a global survey that was done. And what's more shocking for us is that they're not only highly educated, many of them are in STEM education, that is engineering, IT and computers, medicine and natural sciences, and especially those in developing countries are far more highly educated in these subjects than in the developed world. The question that arises is that education, investments in education is a lot of money. Households save money to actually send their children to get them educated in these fields. But by the end of the day, what is happening? Workers are doing these tasks that is absolutely unrelated and underutilized. And that actually begs the question about what is the kind of labor market policy or employment policy we need so that we can actually utilize the skills of these workers for the right kind of jobs. And many of these workers should be engaged in formal jobs with proper work-related protections. And by the end of the day, what we see is a new outsourcing model with Web 2.0, highly educated workers doing lower skilled tasks instead of being engaged in highly educated sectors or skill sectors like services or manufacturing sector. The issues of employment relationship continues to persist. They are identified as self-employed or independent contractors, and there's lack of work-related and social protection benefits, and it's the algorithm that goes about defining whether they'll access work or not, because that's also built in within the system. There are other implications of it in regards to hourly earnings. We tried matching the work done on platforms with that of the traditional labor market, similar type of work for two countries, India and the US, because we had a very good sample. And it was very shocking to see that in platforms, workers got far lower incomes than in the traditional labor market. This is without the benefits. And if you look at it, women earn far lower than men as a result. We also did some analysis comparing across countries. And this was done between India and the US. And it was quite surprising and shocking to see the kind of wage disparities that exist between workers. And you see that American workers earn almost 2.5 times more than that of an Indian worker, both at the median as well as the mean wages. So this begs the question saying that even if you say it's a global labor market, how is it that disparities actually come in? The third narrative that I want to move on is the freelance platforms. And this is to a very large extent, just like the microtask platforms, used by companies both large and small for a whole range of these activities, from computer programming, creative design, finance, legal patent services, and translations. And if you look at it today, many companies have reduced their advertising departments to very small because all the creative design is actually being outsourced to the platforms, and a lot of that work is done through freelancers, basically. Now, what's interesting is, very clearly, and I just want to highlight it here is, this narrative that comes saying that platforms is a kind of, again, a silver bullet to address any sort of an occupational segregation that might exist between men and women. It doesn't do it because it's nothing different from that of a traditional labor market. It's the same jobs that get transposed onto the platforms. And this figure very clearly shows you how some of the IT and tech-related work is still a male-dominated domain, while some of the professional business and sales services are within the women's domain. But unlike that of the microtask platforms, you do find that there is some sort of a skills match, at least in our survey sample, between what they are educated in and what is the type of work that they do. Now, this is to show you how this outsourcing of work happens. And this is something we did for the 2021 report that was launched on platforms and how they transform work. And for this, what we did was, we looked at one of the major freelance platforms in the world, and we tried to understand what is the flow of work and earnings around the world. So there are three things that you can look in this particular slide and the map. One is a circle. This shows you where the work is going. Then is the outer circle, which shows you whether the employer is local or the foreign, and the inner circle, which shows you what the median earnings are. So let's look at the circle per se, and you will find that India, Philippines, Ukraine, Pakistan, Bangladesh are some of the countries where a lot of this work is today being sourced to. And if you look at who are the employers in these countries, you'll find they're all the foreign employers, because the foreign employers are largely based in US, Canada, UK, Australia. And then if you look at the inner circle, which shows you the color of the median earnings, you'll find that the median earnings in US, Canada, Australia, UK are very high, while Philippines, India are very low. So very clearly, there is a cost issue that is there, because the labor cost is quite low in many of these developing countries. A lot of this work comes there, and it's being outsourced. Now, this has two impacts. One is work within the developed countries, that is the global north, will reduce. And what it does is that in the global south, where regulatory systems do not exist well, you are actually exploiting these workers and not providing proper labor social related benefits. So it will lead to increasing inequities between countries and also within the country per se. Now, the education levels of many of those workers are quite high, and also they are also in many specialized fields. And in another place, we do a lot of matching exercises with the skills, and we find that there is a skills mismatch that also exists among many of these workers, where you find a number of these IT workers actually going about doing tasks that is absolutely not related to their work. Similarly, the case is with medicine and natural sciences. So what you see is today with the freelance platforms is a fragmentation of tasks into discrete tasks, which leads to de-skilling of work. So this is happening with secretarial services, where you have AI tools that come in, and AI tools that have come in, and then you find that work moves from global north to global south, and you're not paying them well. But sometimes this fragmentation also leads to de-skilling, because you don't have a full idea of the entire project, but you only have knowledge about the parts. And this is something we see, especially in software programming and coding. So the platformization of work is actually leading to a kind of a precaritization of high-end and high-skilled workers in both the IT and other services, and reallocation of labor from global north to global south. Now, the fourth narrative, I'm just going to keep it very short, is about the reducing the gaps, and this is about the gender gaps. And I just want to say this is not what happens, because as it resembles the traditional labor market, you find that much of the participation rates remains almost the same, irrespective of the region and the country that you look at. occupational segregation persists, as I showed you earlier. This wage differential that exists between the men and women, technology does not really address this issue either. Rather, what you find is that with the platforms, the amount of unpaid time actually increases for many of the workers, which they cannot get their earnings. This is almost about 1/4 of their time, which is taken for preparing proposals or promoting themselves or administrating work. And I think what is far more dangerous on platforms is how, as the costs are being pushed onto the workers, workers have to pay different types of fees to get access to work and have to also pay part of their earnings to the platform to exist on the platform. So that reduces their incomes. But at the same time, what it does is, because rating reputations become central to the entire existence of a worker on a platform, many of them actually end up subsidizing their work, underbidding, or accepting work that they would otherwise decline. So what you're doing is, it's a global labor market, you're pitting one worker against the other, which leads to lower prices, and that has huge impacts on them. And this whole notion of flexibility that exists, actually in reality is not there, because we find workers are working late nights, also because of geographical locations, but also because after their household care responsibilities, that's when they can work. What's interesting is you find new forms of control that are coming in. This is across all the platforms. And here I'm just showing the freelance platforms where workers are asked to have software and hardware on their computers, and they have to actually take screenshots and send it to the client and the platform. And you find increasingly that female workers are more affected, workers in developing countries are more affected. And finally, about the fourth narrative that I do want to say is the social protection gaps. You find increasingly there are huge gaps, workers don't get any social protection, women are affected more than that. There are lots of labor standards that are there already in the ILO that can be used in different fields, and we are having a discussion about that now. But we also see that since the past decade, a number of different regulations that have come across the world. There are two distinctions that I do want to make. One is a distinction that in the global north, where you have good institutions and employment relationship, the debate is much more around employment relationship. In the global north, the discussion is much more about how to provide work safety, social protection, or occupational safety and health. And within the Spanish context, as you might have seen, there is a mandatory employment injury insurance legislation that exists, but I think one of the landmark legislations has been the Riders Law. And I think a lot more needs to be done, but at least that's a very good step forward. So we at the ILO advocate for a number of things that have to be done, because we do feel that diverse practices across countries might not solve the problem, because platforms operate globally, and this requires international policy dialogue and coordination, not only related to areas of labor law, but beyond that, that is data, algorithm, and also portability of worker data and ratings, and also ensuring that workers have access to local jurisdictions. The ILO at the moment is setting up a standard setting process, and this is a quick overview of it. In January this year, it released a law and practice report, including the questionnaire, to the member countries, unions, as well as employer associations. And all of these different constituents are expected to fill up the questionnaire and send it back to the ILO by end of August. Based on the responses, there would be what is called as a yellow report that would be prepared with proposed conclusions, which will be discussed at the RC discussion in June 2025. Based on the discussion, there would be something called as a brown report that would be prepared and shared with the constituents, and the responses that would then be taken and brought into another report and discussed in 2026 ILC. So I think with this, I will stop and leave it to Olivia to take us forward. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Uma, for giving us that global perspective on the topic. I think you've done a very good job at showing us the diversity that there is when we're talking about platforms. You were talking about what we call on-location platforms, where the client and the worker is in the same location. For example, cleaners who are going to client's house, or the riders that are delivering food. You were talking about freelance platforms, and there the client can be on the other side of the world from the worker and be involved in projects that last months. And you were telling us about the micro-task platforms, where you gave us the example of the task that can be as short as 3 minutes long. So how do you regulate such a diverse phenomenon? You know, it cuts across sectors. There are different types of tasks across countries and across labor markets, in the north and in the south. How do you regulate this?
Yeah, that's one of the tough questions, I guess. And that's one of the reasons why the ILC is going to have a discussion at the International Labour Conference. I think let me take it one by one. I think as far as the location-based platforms are there, like, you know, whether you're talking about taxi, delivery, care, domestic work, or personal services, I would say that they operate within the national context. So you can think about national regulations that can actually, or sectoral-based regulations that can actually sort of regulate the work. Now, one of the things that I do have sometimes is that I'm going to take my own country example, and I'm sure we can relate that to the Spanish case in a way. Like, you know, when we talk about taxi driving, in much of the global south, many of these drivers are not unlike in Europe, having a salaried employee status in a way. Many of them are self-employed or work on a casual basis with a company and all of it. But what's interesting is that even when they are self-employed, you have the pricing that is set by the local municipality or the state. And that defines what a ride cost is going to be. And that takes into consideration, you know, the unpaid time, that is the waiting time, and the distance, the fuel cost, and that's revised in a systematic manner. So you can think about bringing that particular regulation that is there to the taxi sector. And I would say within Europe, you already have the taxi sector regulations because you have taxi companies, you have other regulations that exist. So the idea should be, okay, this is a technology that is coming in, but these platforms go and register themselves as a tech company. They should actually be registering themselves as a transport company, and the transport sector regulations should be applied to it. And what's very interesting within this field is that a number of countries in the global south have been doing it. Kenya, and there are a number of other countries in Asia that have started to make these taxi platforms be registered within the sector per se, and then trying to bring that particular regulation for these companies. And I think that could be a very good way to go forward. The same would be for the domestic workers, right? Mm-hmm. You have a domestic worker convention, and if the country has ratified it, why can't we get that same convention to be applied to the platform? Where it does become very challenging, and to an extent the European directive does get into it, but a lot more that has to be done, is the cross-border. Like, you know, when you're talking about freelance platforms, microtask platforms, software programming platforms, how do we actually regulate this trans-border? Now, one of the ideas that we do talk about at the ILO is, well, we have the Maritime Convention. Can we think about a different iteration of the Maritime Convention here? One can think about it, but I think what would be also interesting to look at is that if you look at what is happening within the freelance platforms, what is the work? If it is related to software code programming, if it is related to financial services, if it's related to legal or patent services. These are occupations, or these are sectors which have their own country level regulations. And I think what we need to see is, how do they align with it? Or how do they align with a basic minimum? And I think we need to also rethink about what should be the baseline. And I think here I'd like to get something that has been discussed in some countries within the manufacturing sector. And one of the countries that I really like within that is Germany. Germany has a competition law which says very clearly what should be the baseline price of a product. Before that becomes, below that it becomes anti-competitive, basically. And it takes into consideration the price of the raw materials, the price of labor, so that you're not exploiting, right? And then it says it has to be above that. Now, when you look today, now, if you look at the way the competition law has been done for ages in many parts of the world, it has been the consumer interest in mind, because you want the consumer to get the best out of it. But today, with all these platforms, there's a fine line between you as a consumer and you as a worker. There's so much of exploitation that is happening. So what would be very nice is, within the services sector, if we could have similar practices coming in. The price of a service cannot go down below this level. Then you don't race down to the bottom. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you are going to race down to the bottom. This is already happening within the manufacturing sector. If you're looking at the, garment sector, where Bangladesh has become the rock bottom price because everything is being done there, and we get cheap products in Europe today, all the clothes that we wear in some sense. So, we can think about trying to bring a bit of the competition law into the discussion, which is super important for us to get in. There's also one more thing, and then I'll stop. I think we don't often realize that when we do talk about algorithms and algorithmic transparency, this is actually part of the e-commerce trade rules, because this is a secrecy. This is a business secrecy. And I think it's important for us to get that out from the e-commerce trade treaties and bring it within the labor law dimension and see what can be done there. Mm-hmm. But it's very challenging, yeah.
So you mentioned earlier the riders' law that was passed in Spain in 2021. I think many of us will remember those images of riders riding through empty streets in the rain in the pandemic, when a lot of us were at home, and it was a time of heated debate in this country around the regulation of riders, but also other sectors. And that was a pioneering law at the time. And it has two main components. It presumes the employment of workers on delivery platforms, and also it guarantees the right, through their representatives, the right of workers to access information on the algorithms that are used by the companies, not just in platform work, but in the labor market in general, and how it affects them. So that was 3 years ago. Barely 3 months ago, we had the ministers of labor of all of Europe give the green light to the directive, the European directive. So I wonder, for those of us who might not be very familiar with this directive, could you give us just the highlights of that directive?
I think, it's good that you mentioned about the riders' law, and I think that was one of the pioneer laws that came in, and that actually built the momentum within the European Union, and also the discussion at the EU for the EU directive in a way. By setting what could be achieved and how it could be achieved, because it was a real nice social dialogue process that went through the whole thing. Now, while the riders' law is very specific to the delivery workers, the European directive is far more. I think it touches all of the location-based platforms that I've been talking about, but it also does touch the online web-based platforms, because very clearly it mentions saying that if you have a platform that is operating in a particular country, then the platform has to provide the names of the workers or the number of workers who are working on it to the particular government, so that to see that the work and social related benefits are provided. But the downside of that is also the fact that as many of the companies, because it's European companies, many of the companies that operate in the online space are not necessarily European. They're outside the EU. They're either in the UK, they're in Australia, they're in Israel, they're in the US. Much of that is not applicable. And that's one of the reasons why we need a global regulation. While it's a very good point, it's a global regulation. Now, there are a couple of things that are really great. One is about the presumption of employment. The second is it brings in the whole issue of algorithmic management and the automated decision-making process, where it very clearly specifies on human oversight. And it also talks about transparency. It talks about data protection. And I think these are very, very fundamental as we go by. And I think what it also does, which has been something we've been fighting for, is that platforms have to make available to the countries the number of workers who are actually registered on the platforms on a regular basis. Because, if you were to ask me today, what proportion of the workers in the world work on platforms, or what proportion of workers work in Spain on platforms, I'd be like, frankly, I don't know, because that's the right answer, because we don't know. We do our surveys, and many of us, it is self-administered. There is an attempt to use the labor force surveys and do it, but we don't really get the right figures. There's one estimate that exists for Spain as 2.5%, and that too is from 2018, but we don't know whether it's increased or not. And it becomes very important, especially at the policy level. If you want to regulate something or do something, you need to have this information from the platforms as to, who are the workers who are actually working, how often do they use, how much of the time are they spending, how much are they earning, and what are some of the challenges that are there, so that you can bring the right policies to them.
So throughout this series of conferences, we're putting a focus on what we call vulnerable collectives. So that can be people that have barriers entering the labour market for whatever reason, or remaining in employment, and also specific sectors, like you've mentioned throughout your talk, care and domestic work, which has historically been quite an invisible, undervalued socially sector. So what do we know about the opportunities that platform work can offer people that have difficulties entering the traditional labour market? That's because of cultural norms around women going outside the home to work in certain contexts, for example, or people with certain mobility or disabilities who don't find it so easy to leave their home. Could this be an opportunity for certain groups of people to find work?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question. And it has two sides to it. So let me talk about the positives first, and then go to some of the disadvantages or exploitative practices that come in. We have seen in our work in both the microtask and freelance, and we have followed up the surveys with virtual interviews with many of our survey respondents. Part of it was also checking. And very clearly on microtasking and freelance, you do find that many of the disabled workers who could not, or many of them who have issues around social interactions and all of that, who gets very stressed in traditional workspaces, started using these platforms, and they found that this was really very good for them, because they were able to address some of the challenges that they have in the social context. And being disabled, it's not so easy to get integrated into the traditional market. So they were able to find work and able to do it. And you also did find a lot of women workers who had household work and care responsibilities, because in some of the countries, childcare is very expensive. You also have old parents, and you have to care for them. And somehow the traditional labor market does not provide that flexibility. So they do find that, okay, doing some work on through these platforms while doing that care is very good. So it does support them. But then there is a downside to it. Now, what we have seen also, this is both in the global north countries as well as in the global south, is that especially if you take taxi, delivery, care, to a very large extent, domestic workers, a number of the workers who are actually being engaged in it are actually the vulnerable groups. They could be the refugees, they could be the migrants who are coming in. So what the platform does, it exploits that space and tries to say, we are creating this employment opportunity for you, and it tries to bring them in. And those are the workers who are not unionized, who cannot be, and they're very afraid, right? You cannot be part of any groups because you would be recognized and you might be deported. So they are vulnerable and get further into a precaritized situation because it's like, I better do this, otherwise I'm without anything. So, for us, having done this work, the question would be, how can we look at policies in a way that the traditional labor market can actually address all these issues, whether it is integrating the disabled within the traditional labor market, whether it is providing flexibility for women workers and other workers in the traditional labor market so that you can actually do both household care responsibilities with your work, and how to integrate these migrants and refugees better into the labor market so they are not succumb to this vulnerable situation where they are forced into it. So I think it's thanks to the platforms we know some of these issues. It brings it to the light. And I think it would be great if we can, as part of our policies, look at some of these issues and see what needs correction within our employment policies, or how do we integrate many of them into it, and then try to ensure that platforms also respect some of those policies.
So you were talking about women and women's employment, and earlier in the presentation you made a reference to how the traditional labour market occupations are segregated. So there's more masculine sectors or more feminized sectors traditionally, and that's still the case. There has been some very interesting studies done in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, in the delivery and taxi sectors, where they looked at the differences between male and female riders or drivers, and they found that women were working fewer hours because of the care responsibilities. They were earning less money than the male riders and drivers. And also another reason was their perception and experience of the public space at night, for example. They were more likely to cancel a ride or a trip, a ride to an area that they thought was unsafe. So that means reduction in their earnings as well. So although the platforms have also made it easier, the women were saying that they had found it easier to enter those sectors than if they had gone in the traditional route, because they just had to download the app and there was fewer barriers of entry than if they had gone through the traditional way. We are seeing the same dynamics in terms of the gaps in pay and hours of work. So what could be done, Uma, if anything, to foment or encourage gender equality in work in general through platforms? Could anything be done in terms of how these issues around pay and access to work is, or is it more of the same?
I think, like I said, what a platform setting is doing is replicating or emulating the traditional setting and worsening the situation per se. But it's good that you bring this point about women entering taxi and delivery sector. So, one of the narratives that we see, and this is across the world now, and this is coming from the policy angle, and, platforms are quite smart in a way. They pick this narrative pretty well. So what we have seen is the issue of employment generation, the issue of reducing the gender gaps, has led many of these delivery and taxi companies to say, oh, well, we're recruiting a lot of women into the platform. And, they have, in many countries, opened up lines or women-led cabs in some of the African countries to be started off. So, you recruit a lot of women onto the platform. Excellent, great. But then what happens? Because it's the algorithm that works around it, and women during the peak hours can't actually get onto the labor market, because those are the hours when you have household care, child care, and household responsibility. So the surge pricing that the taxi has, they are not able to benefit from that. That goes to the men. Again, when during a certain particular time when they cannot take a ride and cancel the ride, that has impacts on the ratings, so they don't get access to work. So, it depends upon how you set up the algorithm, how you set up the platform design. You can do. It's not that it cannot be done. Can we think of a platform design that brings in neutrality for both men and women? It brings in a way that, okay, you understand, you're talking about the flexibility discourse, right, of the platform. Can we ensure that that same flexibility, you can figure out what are the hours that women work, when are they available? Can you have a pricing mechanism that is as right as in the tradition so that women can actually gain from it? If you do that, you can bring about equality in both, in largely, I would say, in pace, because hours of work doesn't matter to me. Hours of work, one of the issues why men work more hours is, that certain hours of the day you get more work, so you get. But I think what we should be also thinking about is, many of these sectors where we talk about, where working hours are very high, how is it that this technology is not coming and addressing that issue of long working hours and reducing the working hours? Rather, it remains the same or it gets higher. Technology should be reducing it and trying to make it efficient. But why doesn't it happen? Why do workers work more hours? It's largely because you're not able to earn a decent income. So you need to extend your working hours. So the issue is, how do you value work? And what is the price for that work? And this is a debate we have in the traditional labor market. Like, I think I don't have to say, healthcare workers, nurses, we all agree are very important for our society. It's very important as we get into the future. Domestic workers, same. How are they paid? They're largely women-dominated sectors. Any country that you look at, the pay is lowest. I thought that the COVID-19 pandemic would actually expose this, and we would get into a debate on valuation of this job. It's so important. Why is it valued so badly? Workers work incredible number of hours. The shifts are about 12 hours. What do they get paid? Nothing. How are they respected? Just clapping for them every day is not an answer. You need to do something at the policy level. And I think this valuation for me is fundamental both in the traditional labor market, and once you value that, ensure that the platforms have the same valuation. That's the only way you can bring about equality.
So how do we value work?
Value
and what work
is,
do we value? It's a very important question. I'd like to pause here to see if anybody in the audience would like to ask a question. You can ask in Spanish or English. We will collect 2 or 3 questions, and then Uma can reply. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. It was super interesting. I was thinking about potential incentives for governments to change these and make new policies, and I was constantly thinking about taxes, and I think this is something you haven't touched much about. So with the move from employer-employee relationship to self-employment, is there any analysis or any thoughts about what's the impact of that on taxation and tax collection from governments?
And there's a question over here, so then...
Thank you. I'm going to ask in Spanish. Is better. Muchas gracias por la explicación. De verdad que ha sido un repaso de la legislación a nivel mundial muy, muy interesante. Solo una pregunta que creo que, por si puedes orientar en la respuesta, porque en España, como bien has indicado, tenemos una ley Rider que costó muchísimo sacar adelante, pero que nosotros, compañero Franz y yo, venimos de Comisiones Obreras de Cataluña, es el sindicato más importante de Cataluña y del Estado, y hemos luchado mucho para que se aplique algo que ya está regulado, pero no se está haciendo. Entonces, estamos pidiendo los algoritmos y tampoco los dan, aunque estén en la ley. Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿cómo va a resolver la directiva europea algo que ya está regulado? Es decir, nosotros en España, los trabajadores de plataformas de reparto ya deberían estar laboralizados y no lo están haciendo. Entonces, se están encontrando siempre estas maneras de saltarse la ley, lo cual perjudica a millones de personas. Entonces, ¿qué garantías tenemos que con la directiva, si esto se vaya a corregir, o otros países, si tienes alguna experiencia de cómo están haciendo que se cumpla? Porque el Ministerio de Trabajo está encima, hay inspecciones de trabajo con multas millonarias a las principales empresas del sector y nada está funcionando. Entonces, no sabemos ya qué hacer. ¿Cómo hacemos que la normativa sea efectiva? Porque el papel lo aguanta todo, pero no se está cumpliendo. Muchas gracias.
Are there any other questions?
I think you can answer those, yeah.
I think two very good questions, and I was just hoping you would not ask me that. But it's good that you ask, and let me first take the taxation one. Yes, I didn't get into the taxation issue, but there are two things that are there. Number one, I would say that I don't think we have done any systematic study to understand the implications on taxation as a result of shift from salaried employees to self-employed or independent contractors, because it could be done, but I don't think we have reached that stage of understanding what the implications could be. Also because it could be possible that in many countries, workers are not coming up to the tax bracket itself, where you are taxed, and they fall below that. But this is something that will have to be done. But there's another point that comes up, which I think is very important to look at and address. And this is something that the OECD has been talking about it, which we picked up in our report in 2021, is the virtual nature of the platforms. So, as these platforms are virtual, especially the online platforms, if you do bring about a taxation on the platform per se, because even that is not happening. These platforms are at the moment not taxed, and that's a debate we need to have. If you start taxing them, it becomes the same story that we see in the traditional segment, where you have tax havens, and they go and establish their headquarters there and move around it. But here, it's even far more problematic because it's virtual. The minute you get any regulation, even linked to the labor, they can just move across and they can have the registration. And the question is, I don't think any of the directives or any of the regulatory discussion is going there. We are so concentrated on the labor issue that the larger picture is not really looked at, and that's something that would be important to look at. And I think your point on looking at the impacts of the shift in employment status, what the impact on it would be on taxation, is also super important to look, which we haven't really touched upon. But there's only one point I would like to say, even related to that, is because I'm very well versed in these debates on taxation and the informal economy coming from the global south, because there's always this issue saying that you are in the informal economy to evade taxes. But that's not necessarily true. Often it's a tax bracket that decides. It is possible that in certain manufacturing sectors, certain small-scale companies set up a number of multiple enterprises to evade taxes. But I think that debate also needs to be looked at in a very careful way, I would say. Now, coming to the riders' law, I'm very, very aware about what's happening. We have done a policy impact study in Spain, looking at the impact of the riders' law on both the platform companies and the workers. And what comes out from one of the recommendations we are giving in that particular study, which will be released in October, is that you need effective regulation from the part of the state to do something about it. Because we also know that despite fines, nothing has happened. Companies, one of the issues that came up is that because of the implementation of the riders' law, some of the platform companies might leave. That did not happen. They are still here. They do not abide by the law, and they continue doing what they want. They do not give the employment state. But I think here, the only way that it could be done is the state takes over a huge control and just implements it in a big way. And I think that's the only way out. I don't know, the only country that I can think about where it has been effective, there are two countries. One is Australia, the other one is Canada, where in both of them it was particular constituencies which were able to implement it so effectively. The net result was that the platforms exited the country in both the cases. So I think in Spain we expected the same when the riders' law came out in 2021, and we were like, okay, let's see what would happen, but they didn't. And we know that the amount of lobbying that has been going on. Now the hope is that with the European directive, will we be able to muster more power to push and influence it at that level? It's just one hope that I have, but that we will see now when the implementation comes in. And as you say very rightly, on the algorithms, when the riders' law came out and when I saw that, I was like, how is it going to happen? Because I know it's part of the e-commerce trade treaties. Now, I think there probably what is needed is understanding better. And here I want to also make a point, because I used to believe also that the source code of the algorithm is very, very important for us to get into the understanding how you can correct it. But I think I have also evolved over the last couple of years since I said that in the 2021 report, is that source code by itself cannot help us, because there's so much of machine learning that is done that the initial code and what comes out later is far more complicated. And even if we get it, what are we going to do? So what would be important for us to get into is to say, can we be more clear about what are the indicators that are going into it, and be transparent about it and understand how the workings of it happen? Probably if we can demand that, it would be far more better, because I do know that we've been trying to get more information about it, but we haven't managed. This was in 2022, if I'm not wrong. I was at a conference in France, where we had a presentation from the French government, actually, because the financial department ministry has set up something on trying to audit the algorithm. They don't get the algorithm per se, but they have come up with a mechanism in which they try to use or develop an algorithm which is very close to what is there and try to replicate it and see how you can regulate it. So, that's the only way of auditing and going about it. But that again doesn't take us too far. But I think what would be very important for us to say is that what are the parameters or indicators that are very important for us to ensure? And for me, it goes back in a way to say, if we have certain regulations that are there in the sector, why don't we just apply that? And then say, you use the technology just for the matching, period. That will solve the problem. It's very good to do the matching. It's fantastic in a way. You use the best of that technology and then try doing it. There's an experiment that is being done in Bangalore in India, where one of the tech companies in collaboration with the government, is come up with an app called Namayatri for the taxi or the auto sector, and there they are trying to do the matching. So I think we can simplify and say, we don't want these algorithms, let's have just the matching. That's what, you want to connect workers, right? Earlier we would do it through a phone book or through some other data. You can use the same data and do the matching. Why do we need all this sophisticated algorithm? Tell me. I think we can cushion that whole process, and I feel that's where we should be going. Instead of being bought over and being caught into that entire thing.
So this reminds me, last week we had Ana Ginés talk about algorithmic management in the workplace, and she made a reference to how it can be very useful if we're trying to protect workers' health and safety, for example, to have a sensor that tells you that you have been sitting for too long and that you need to stand up. So this reminds me of how technology could be designed in a different way. And there are examples of platform cooperatives, associations of domestic workers, cleaners, that have come together and are designing their own app with their own values, with what is important for them. And these are very useful and interesting case studies, because it's very often the business decision and the context, not so much the tool itself, that has an impact. So thinking about the design of the technology, I think this is important for all the conferences that we're having. Any other questions? So I have another question for you, Uma, that I will just take the last 5 minutes to ask you. And it's related to this, what we were talking about, the design of the technology. And in the first session, for those of you who were with us, Cecilia Castaño, in 10 minutes, told us about the different industrial revolutions, and starting with the first one and the impact that the introduction of the steam engine had. And we were talking about how that impacted the way of life and the working conditions, especially through the telar. I don't know, I can't remember the example now in English. How it was automated, how you manufacture cloth, right?
Yeah.
And 200 years on, we're talking about how technology is impacting and impacting working conditions. And some people say that we're now in the fourth industrial revolution. So I wanted to ask you a question around this, Uma. Do you think are we talking about a fourth industrial revolution? Are we seeing that sort of same dimension of impact that we've seen in previous revolutions? And what do you see going forward? What do you see for the next 10, 15, 20 years?
Yeah.
That's two questions in one.
Yeah, I think fourth industrial revolution is quite a broad context. In a way, you talk about automation, robotics, digital transformations, all of it. I would say that we've been doing some systematic work in understanding algorithmic management practices also, because it's often associated with digital labor platforms. And my take is it's actually even before that. And much of the issues we are talking about, data, automated decision-making, all of that, goes actually to and even monitoring and surveillance, goes back to the mid-80s with the ICT revolution, and also with integration of a lot of ICT into some of the high-tech industries, that is automobiles and electronics. So if you go back to the early 90s and look at some of the work around automobiles and electronics, what we are talking about already existed. The data was also something that was very important, and the fears that we talk about were also there. But the question remains, how can policy actually see some of the repercussions, some of the implications, and then put in place right policies that, even if this data is collected, is not utilized to implicate workers, but is utilized only for the best of the purposes of improving certain parameters of efficiency or providing welfare for the workers. So it's, the way we try to come up with policies and protect workers. For me, that's very important. And I think that's a debate I find that we are not really engaging in. There's a bit of a debate on data on one hand, AI on one hand, algorithmic management. But I think this whole thing needs to be looked at in a much more comprehensive way to understand, hey, what's happening and what are the kind of policies that are required. So while the regulations are happening, I would also like to say that it doesn't matter whether we are talking about the Global South or Europe today, because I find the unemployment levels are very high across the globe. Poverty levels are high, inequalities are increasing. I really think that we need to think about, be more creative in trying to understand what is the kind of society we want, how do we want to move forward, what is the levels of automation we want to, and do we really want the sedentary life of sitting at our homes and having delivery workers deliver goods and food in our house? No. We have to really rethink about it, and there the thinking is also about, what is the kind of employment policies do we need? What is the kind of skills that are required? What are we training our next generation of children? What are the skills that we need? And how do we want to progress? And I think this for me is a larger debate that we need to have and discuss, to think about what we are doing, rather than saying, okay, what the implications of this 4IR is, because we can decide as a society what the limits of these technologies should be. And we can say, well, we do not want this. And I think the biggest power, according to me, is the consumers. If the consumers tomorrow say, no, this is not the way we want to move, and we want employment that is more meaningful, right? Can we ask the question ourselves, what I'm doing, how does it help our societies? How do I help our people? How does it help me in my knowledge and my own development? I think if we raise some of these fundamental questions, I think we will move in a completely different way than what we are doing, and not accepting that any job is a better job because it just gives us income. I think we want more than that money. Money is important, but utility of it, its helpfulness to the society, its helpfulness for the development. I think these are fundamental today as we move forward.
I think you made a very important point about the context of platform work, that it didn't come out of nowhere. Digital platforms didn't emerge from nothing. There was a context there of previous decades of trends in changes in the employment and the labour market, externalization of work, the fracturing of the workplace, they call it the fissured workplace, deregulating the labour market in general for the last few decades, together with, at the intersection of the increase of technology, computer power, the internet, the access to data in a very accelerated way. So those two things together have provided the fertile ground for the rise of digital labour platforms, which is what we were talking about today. So I think I'll switch to Spanish to do the closure, Uma. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí en esta tercera sesión de este ciclo. La semana que viene tendremos la cuarta y última sesión. Tendremos a representantes de diferentes entidades del tercer sector y también de la empresa privada que trabajan en el tema de la inclusión, que es un tema que ha salido hoy en las sesiones anteriores, ya que el sector tecnológico es uno de los sectores que está en crecimiento. La pregunta que les haremos es cómo podemos hacer para que ese sector sea más inclusivo, y escucharemos de sus experiencias, de las oportunidades y también de las barreras que hay para personas que están en situación vulnerable, ya sea por una procedencia migrante o porque tienen alguna discapacidad. ¿Qué oportunidades hay para que entren en el sector tecnológico y que a la vez ese sector sea más inclusivo y más diverso? Muchísimas gracias, primero de todo, a Uma por estar aquí presencialmente desde Ginebra con nosotros esta mañana, Muchísimas gracias. Había más de 170 personas registradas para seguirnos desde toda España online, así que muchas gracias por vuestra atención, como siempre. Y muchas gracias a todas las personas que están aquí hoy presencialmente en Palau Macaya. Es un gusto ver caras conocidas ya de las sesiones anteriores y espero veros la última ya el jueves que viene. Así que un aplauso muy fuerte para Uma, por favor.